Let me introduce our panelists for the evening. Marisa Chappelle is an associate professor of history at Oregon State University. Her scholarship specializes in 20th century United States history with a particular focus on politics, social policy, and the political economy of race and gender. Her book on the politics of welfare reform in the late 20th century, The War on Welfare, Family, Poverty, and Politics in Modern America, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in fall 2009. She was also involved with the United Academics of Oregon State University Faculty Union from infancy and was part of the bargaining team that secured the union's first contract in 2020. All the way over there, Naomi is a member of Maoist Communist Union and Corvallis Revolutionary Study Circle. She has been organizing with various socialist and anti-imperialist groups in Corvallis for over 8 years. From this, she began to study Marxism and has been doing so ever since. Her study and practice, she is now a Marxist-Leninist Maoist. Casey Haxton, right here, is a working-class political activist and organizer based in Oregon, with a background working with socialist movements, organizations, and candidates across the region since 2011. Casey is most proud of the coalition building work they did over the last 13 years to found a nonprofit organization providing services for homeless and poor folks in Ashland, creating a campaign to raise the state's minimum wage, preventing millions in cuts to Oregon State universities, and promoting mass transit in Washington County. Lance Parrish recently graduated from Oregon State University. His first political activity outside of reading Marx began when he came into contact with various left communist organizations, which prompted him to recently create a blog called the PNW Internationalist, focused on providing a Marxist perspective on issues. The guidelines for the panel are: panelists will have a maximum of 12 minutes for their initial remarks. I've let them know that they'll have to wrap up when the timer goes off, but they will be able to expand their thoughts during the Q&A period. And after that, they'll be given an opportunity to respond to one another for 3 minutes. We've asked them to use this time to help clarify differences and similarities among their remarks. We hope this will set the stage for a lively, respectful, and focused Q&A with all of you. And I'll wind things down at 7:45 and allow the panelists to make some concluding remarks, after which we plan to keep the conversation going at American Dream on Monroe. For tonight, we asked the panelists to respond to the following prompt. Since the 2016 and 2020 Sanders campaigns, the Millennial Left has largely pursued its politics within or in relationship to the Democratic Party. However, since Biden's election in 2020, the left has displayed increasing discontent with the Democratic Party, most notably with the recent Israel-Gaza war. There are now calls to break with the Democratic Party, for instance, the epithet for Biden as Genocide Joe. The present discontent with the Democratic Party recalls the New Left protest of the 1968 Democratic National Convention over the Vietnam War. It also raises the original alliance of the left with the Democratic Party in the 1930s Popular Front during the New Deal. What is the Democratic Party? What is the history of the left's relationship with the Democratic Party, both during the Millennial Left and its deeper history? What is the difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party? Should the left break with the Democratic Party? How has the left attempted to do this historically? How successful were those attempts, and what would such a thing be today? And we'll start in the order of introduction with Marisa.
All right, so I'm here as the historian. I want to start with 2 framing points. The first is to clarify what I mean when I talk about the left. Very often the left refers to specific radical formations or commitments, anarchist, socialist, communist, that are committed to the destruction of capitalism. Many of y'all in this room probably know way more about that history than I do, of very particular self-consciously communist, socialist, and leftist cadres, etc. I'm going to talk, because I think it's more helpful in this history in thinking about the relationship to the Democratic Party. I'm going to think more capaciously about the left, and what I mean by that are activists and organizations that oppose the destructive impacts of capitalism, even if they're not explicitly calling for the overthrow of capitalism, advocate social, political, and economic equality, advocate for expansive and participatory democratic governance, and believe in working class empowerment. And that last one maybe is the sharpest break with liberals historically. The second framing point I want to make is that the Democratic Party has always been a site of contest. It's a complicated, uneasy coalition with groups that hold a range of ideological positions and policy agendas. So with those framing remarks, I kind of want to make two arguments from the point of history. The first is that the left has had the most success in shaping the Democratic Party, pulling it leftward, when it's been connected to broad grassroots mobilizations. So examples of this historically: the Progressive era, amidst mass grassroots insurgency of workers and farmers, the Populists or People's Party had local state policy victories and brought their agenda into the Democratic Party, calling for state action to drastically reform capitalism in a whole variety of ways. There's a very good argument to be made that the People's Party, when it fused with the Democrats, got co-opted, right? And that's certainly true, but it also changed the party at the same time. Moving forward to the 1930s is a second example. Mass grassroots insurgency of workers, often mobilized thanks to Communist Party organizers and other left organizers, created an atmosphere in which a broad popular front left was able to reshape the Democratic Party again, and we get the New Deal. So we see a solidified commitment to using the state's redistributive and regulatory powers to shape a more moral capitalism. And the Popular Front also really made racial justice, often in the form of racial liberalism, and religious and racial pluralism central to the Democratic Party. So amidst mass insurgency, the left was able to mobilize a broad enough group of folks to change the Democratic Party. Obviously not as much. There's problems, we could talk about that. The Democratic Party's transformation, though, then left little room for left party building efforts, especially because organized labor now was in that Democratic coalition, right, and depended on the Democratic Party for policy, etc. We get the 40s and 50s, right, where the complexities of the Cold War and the virulence of anti-communist politics disrupted, broke up, marginalized that broad popular front, sidelined the left influence in the Democratic Party, and really sidelined class politics as, something that folks felt like they could talk about. We do see some alternative party building, so Henry Wallace in 1948 and the Progressive Party, but not very successful at all. But then we get another mass grassroots insurgency in the Black Freedom Movement and the movements that sort of came out of it in the 1960s, and that mobilization opened up space again for left ideas and left activism and sparked efforts to get the Democratic Party to expand the promise of the New Deal on economic security and democracy, especially with civil rights and voting rights legislation and Medicaid, Medicare, etc. Like the Popular Front before it, the Black Freedom Movement was a broad movement, an eclectic movement, but socialists and other leftists were key activists in it, and many of the agendas coming out of it, like Baird Rustin's Freedom Budget for All Americans, were socialist or close to socialist, democratic socialist. Okay, so, and the Black Freedom Movement also obviously transformed the Democratic Party by, in effect, causing white Southerners to leave, most white Southerners to leave the Democratic Party. Okay, the second history lesson here I want to make, I'm going to check my time.
6 minutes.
Okay, I'm good. Is that leftists and progressives of various stripes continued to see the Democratic Party as the vehicle for moving their agendas in the last 3 decades of the 20th century for many reasons. One is that there are significant barriers to alternative party formation and success. Many of those barriers constructed by the Democratic Party and the Republican Party to secure their own dominance. The election rules, just the way the election system works in the United States with winner-take-all and other aspects, really risks the spoiler role. And the Democratic Party, to many on the left, seemed like the only political formation that was capable of articulating a vision and a policy agenda that can win a majority support in the United States. So let me give some examples of left efforts to shape the Democratic Party and pull it leftward after the 60s, which were less than effective even when accompanied by grassroots mobilization. So in the 1970s, the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee built a broad coalition, created the Democratic Agenda, and won a very progressive platform from the Democrats, but couldn't get the Carter administration or Democratic members of Congress to actually work to implement that agenda. In the 1970s, members of ACORN, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, which is the organization I'm writing about now, worked to turn the party into a working class party, and they pushed reforms that would have mandated working class representation in party governance, created local party, what do they call them? I didn't write it down. Basically local party building councils that would screen candidates and etc. So they really tried to institutionalize working class participation in party governance, and they remarkably won a commission and really dominated that commission, but party leaders rejected those reforms. In the 70s and 80s, another broad formation, the Citizen Labor Energy Coalition, pressed Democrats, and this was a coalition of like 80 organizations across sort of the progressive, various issues. They pressed the Democrats to reject the deregulation of natural gas prices, and they pressed for utility rate reform. This spawned Citizen Action, which built more than 24 statewide progressive coalitions that elected left-leaning candidates and won various policy victories on utilities, healthcare, hazardous materials, etc. And then into the 80s, Jesse Jackson runs for the Democratic nomination for president in 1984 and especially in 1988, led many on the left to hope that Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition could kind of create the structure for a lasting progressive coalition that could either really pull the Democratic Party leftward or could turn into something outside of the Democratic Party. For a variety of reasons that didn't happen, not least among them, Jesse Jackson had very little interest in building such a thing. In a post-mortem after the 1988 election, Wade Rathke, who was chief organizer of ACORN, noted that, quote, institutional labor had more delegates than they ever had in the Democratic Party's convention in '88, but they still had to swallow Benson, who was Lloyd Benson, the Texas centrist, who was the vice presidential nominee. It begged the question, he wrote, of whether operating exclusively within the Democratic Party is not simply an exercise in co-optation. And this is the question that right leftists have asked themselves over and over again, and there's not an easy answer to it. As the Democratic Leadership Council took the reins of the party in the 90s, there were more efforts to build alternative leftist political parties outside of the Democratic Party, including something called the New Party, which then evolved in some places into the Working Families Party, and of course the Green Party. The New Party and the Working Families Party used what they called an inside-outside strategy, which is that they would endorse candidates of other parties, try to cross-endorse. That was made illegal in many places by Democrats and Republicans who didn't want that to happen. but they had some successes. I'm going to end there, the history lesson.
We can move on to Natalie.
Thank you. The Democratic Party is a capitalist party. They are made up of capitalists, they are funded by capitalists, and most importantly, they further the continuation of capitalist exploitation of workers and the system that enables it. They represent the interest of a faction of the US imperialist bourgeoisie and can never represent the interest of the exploited and oppressed masses of the US or the world. They are the enemy just as much as the Republican Party. Despite some progressive rhetoric deployed by the Democrats, they are merely looking to co-opt progressive and working class movements, such as the movement against the genocide in Palestine right now. Those oppressed by capitalism and imperialism must break away from any illusions that the Democrats will save us. Only then can we forge an independent politics that will lead to liberation. Only a communist vanguard party can represent the true interests of the working class. That interest is the overthrow of the capitalist class, the establishment of socialism, and the progression towards communism. Finally, under a stateless, classless, communist society, will the world be free from exploitation and oppression. The best examples of such vanguard parties were those who led the revolutions in Russia in 1917 and China in 1949. We do not have such a party in the US today. Thus, the immediate task of Marxists in this country is to build such a party. The Maoist Communist Union, or MCU for short, the pre-party organization that I am a member of, is gearing our work towards doing just that. As communists, MCU has already broken with the Democrats. It is our job now to clarify the reasons why this is necessary and win over those sections of the left and the working class more broadly who are still invested in the idea that the Democratic Party can save us. This is the foundation I'm working from, and this is the communist view. The current state of the working class movement and the communist movement in this country is that both are quite weak and independent of each other, leading to both of them being all the more weak and ineffective. Because the Democratic Party has been able to play the role of co-option of progressive social movements and collaborator with reactionary union leaders, in 2020, a broad section of the masses took to the streets in righteous indignation over the racist treatment of Black people in this country. At first, there was violent oppression and condemnation of the protests by Democratic Party politicians. Supposed progressive Governor of Minnesota and Vice Presidential candidate Tim Walz called in the National Guard to repress these protests. Quickly, the strategies changed. City councils began promising police reform, cops began kneeling with protesters, and the Democratic Party began to shape the narrative about what the protests are really for. Rather than the fight against racist oppression, the message shifted to be about symbolic reforms and opposition to Trump and the Republicans. The Democrats were able to effectively use the energy from these protests to win another election. Something we are seeing happen again with Kamala Harris attempting to brand herself as somehow more pro-Palestine, despite being in the very government that has been supplying Israel with everything they want to carry out the genocide in Gaza. When looking at the Democratic Party, we must not look at it in isolation, but we must consider it in comparison with the Republican Party and situate both in relation to the overall system of capitalist imperialism. Some claim that the Democrats are the lesser evil, but this really misses the point. This argument misunderstands the nature of the Democratic Party and the nature of the problems that face the masses of people in the world today. The Democrats may use progressive language and claim to support some progressive policies, but their interests firmly lie with the oppression and exploitation of the people. If we wish to stand with the people and work to solve their problems, the Democrats and the ideology of lesser evilism is an obstacle. For what kind of a worldview and attitude is believing we can't really make the world a better place, but only a less evil one? This is a nihilistic, pessimistic idea that leads to people not struggling against their oppressors and exploiters, but uniting with them. It leaves us in an endless cycle that serves to mystify the reality of the capitalist system and uphold oppression. Revolutionary optimism and organizing to build a revolutionary movement is the antidote to this depressing cycle of US electoral politics. The collective work that I am doing in MCU has given me far more hope and fulfillment in my life than buying into any of the escapist fantasies that the capitalist media tries to sell us ever did. But back to the two parties. So the two factions of the US ruling class, represented by the Democrats and Republicans, have a shared but divided interest. They are tightly linked but have important differences that we ignore at our own peril. Both parties represent not the interests of the broad mass of the people in the United States, but different factions of the ruling capitalist imperialist class. Understanding this will help to reveal the malicious nature of the two parties and the need for the left to break with both and move towards establishing a communist party and fusing it with the working class movement. The latest crisis of capitalist imperialism has necessitated a shift by the US ruling class. Capitalism is always laying the groundwork for its next crisis. As these crises grow, capitalist parties have to develop new strategies for maintaining the rule and the exploitation and oppression of the masses. Neoliberalism is one such strategy that has guided the capitalist system for the last 40 years. But it is coming to an end. A new era of neo-mercantilism is emerging. We must understand that the end of neoliberalism is not the end of capitalism. As communists, we don't want to see an end to one kind of capitalist rule in exchange for another. We want a permanent end to oppression and exploitation. This will only be a brief overview of this emerging contradiction in the global system. For those who want to know more, there's a zine made by MCU at our table back there, as well as a forthcoming article in MCU's journal Red Pages on the topic. The shift to neo-mercantilism is primarily being driven by inter-imperialist competition between China and the US. Democrats and Republicans are in agreement. China's rise must be prevented, and that this will require major changes in the global system. But there are different ideas about how to implement these changes and how quickly, which reflect competing interests. The Democrats generally have more ties with multinational corporations who want to retain access to China, leading to a preference for delaying rapid shifts, while Republicans have more ties to domestic manufacturing and have advocated a speedier withdrawal from China. Both see the basis for moving towards a global system, though. With the prospect of reindustrialization brought on by neo-mercantilism, there is an important opening for communists in the working class movement. A militant working class movement within these reestablished industries could prove costly to the plans of the capitalist class, and they know it. Because of this, we have seen both parties have placed more importance on courting the trade unions and their collaborationist leaders, such as Sean and Brian of the Teamsters, who spoke at the Republican National Convention. So the work of the Communist Party USA, or CPUSA, in the 1920s and 30s is a key part of our history, and we can learn a tremendous amount from. Their successes, failures, and eventual turn to revisionist politics, in which they abandoned revolution, must be studied by communists today. In the early 1920s, the bulk of the CPUSA's work on the electoral front was not with the Democrats, but with the various efforts to build a labor party, which would allow the workers' economic struggle to be raised to a higher level of political struggle. The growing demands for a labor party in the working class movement today is a sign that more advanced workers see the basis for breaking with the Democrats and taking independent political action. While only a communist vanguard party can represent the ultimate interest of the working class and oppressed masses, a labor party can serve as an important vehicle for working class political struggle and raising class consciousness. But because of its many contradictions, it should be understood as a united front. With unity comes struggle, as these different political and class forces are in contradiction. Therefore, the united front is also a struggle front and needs to be approached as such. When engaging in united front, we must be aware of the problems that can arise with this kind of work, and some of the mistakes in aligning too closely with the capitalist party like the Democrats and allowing them to lead a movement, which is what happened with the CPUSA and their fall to revisionist politics. As a response to the rise of fascism, the Communist International adopted a policy called the Popular Front, where communist parties around the world would unite with and build up a coalition of political and class forces against fascism. This policy had some correct aspects to it, but In the US, it led to fully subordinate the struggle under the Democratic Party and FDR. This put the CPUSA on the path to revisionism and class collaborationism from which it would never return. Understanding of this history teaches us that communists must always have a concrete analysis of our situation and the necessary steps we must take to advance to revolution. At this stage, the revolutionary movement is small and isolated from the working class movement. There is widespread confusion on many topics within the broader left. Because of this, MCO has identified one of our primary tasks as the need to clarify Marxism, which today is Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, to the broader left and struggle to win them over to it. Working within the two capitalist parties or obscuring what they truly are will only hinder this. Any coalition we would join with them would lead to liquidating our movement and abandoning our politics. If we want to confront the problems the oppressed and exploited masses face today, we must shed the false hopes that come with believing that the lesser evil might save us, and inevitable disappointments and nihilism that comes with that. Instead, we must place our faith in those masses of people and begin the work of constructing a revolutionary movement led by a communist party. As Marx said, the point of his work was to change the world. I encourage everyone to cast off the capitalist illusions tied up with the electoral spectacle and embrace the hope and excitement that comes with revolutionary optimism. An end to exploitation and oppression is possible, and we should struggle until this becomes reality. The oppressed and exploited have far more to win than an election. We have a world to win.
Thank you. We'll go to Casey.
Okay. Yeah, so I've already been introduced, but I'll do a little bit of a brief introduction. I'm 36 years old. I just moved to Corvallis earlier this year. I'm studying at OSU. Got a degree at PCC last year. I'm not going to go into all of it, but I'll just say that I did spend a lot of time working within the Democratic Party of Oregon specifically. So when I talk about the Democratic Party, I'll probably be referencing more the state party. The Democratic Party exists at many different levels, local, state, national level. And that brings me to my next point. I'm going to try to answer these questions as best I can. What is the Democratic Party? Not the easiest question to answer. It's very old. It's the oldest continually existing political party in the world today, at more than 200 years old now. And it's gone through a lot of different phases and changed a lot, so it's hard to kind of boil it all down into one thing. So I've kind of separated into two poles, that the party has sort of a political party version and an institutional party. And these two poles, it sort of starts out at one and then swings to the other. Because like all parties that take power, it faces problems of corruption and people joining the party to just get power and not for any specific political agenda. This is not unique to the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party is maybe the best example of seeing this in the world, because it has existed for many decades as more or less just that, a party which wealthy aristocrats and members of the ruling class go to seek power, placating the ruling class. So at its broadest level, I'm going to talk about this sort of at a social level and at a great man theory, because it's easier to speak narratively about a thing like the Democratic Party if you talk about it as individuals. So at the broadest level and the sociological level, I think when it's at its best, it is sort of a coalition of the middle class. When it was first formed 200 years ago, they didn't have these terms like middle class and blue collar and white collar, and it may have not applied as much back then, but I still think it kind of was that coalition of what would have then been the middle class. You had in Jackson, you had Jacksonian democracy, where he, under his leadership, the party helped expand the voter franchise to remove the property requirement, which exploded the amount of people that could vote in this country more than 5 times over. And so that was one of the things that Jackson did that really appealed to the, I guess I'm moving into the great man theory. So anyway, it is a coalition, I'll just get back to between like high-minded progressive liberals and more reactionary, lower class, oftentimes racist, farmers and yeomen and peasants and workers and rural peoples. But at the more narrowest level, it is basically easiest to represent the Democratic Party in one of two presidents, either Andrew Jackson or Franklin Roosevelt, the two presidents that helped really define the party as we know today. Both were very popular among the people in their time, but kind of hated by the establishment. They both proposed and enacted very populist economics domestically, but also kind of did aggressive imperialist expansion, what would have been internationally back then, though we think of it now as the continental United States. Andrew Jackson, though though he was hated by the banks and loved by the people, and he expanded the powers and all that, he also is known for the Trail of Tears, and massive genocides of Native Americans, which at the time weren't as controversial as they are now. So I would say too, with Franklin Roosevelt, you also have very popular, hated by the establishment, hated by the banks, took on the banks, aggressive imperialist expansion. We don't often think about this, but the US empire really became the thing that we know today in World War II under the control of FDR. There were certainly spots in his record. So the New Deal, like Jacksonian democracy, gave real reforms to the left. It gave red meat, and it helped co-opt the left where they couldn't be excluded. They had to be taken in. But like with the New Deal, like with Jacksonian democracy, it left out huge segments of mostly people of color. So the New Deal, for those who don't know, established minimum wage, labor protections as we know it today, but those labor protections still to this day do not apply to farm workers and domestic workers, which were historically done by slaves and today are mostly done by immigrant labor, people of color. So not exclusively, but largely and disproportionately. Even in Oregon today, we have probably about, I did estimates recently, probably over 200,000 workers in Oregon today who are working on farms and in your homes who are not allowed to form a union according to federal and state laws. So anyway, this is the New Deal. It's easier to criticize Jackson, I guess, and the problems because they're further back, but even today, it's sometimes a little bit touchy to criticize the New Deal. But anyway, to wrap up, FDR, of course, biggest spots on his record were probably the Japanese internment camps, and which did necessitate reparations later on, and of course the mass bombings, largely of Japan, but also of Europe and other parts of the world, mass bombings that to this day are still criticized and widely not seen as the most effective means of having won the war, or any war for that matter ever, as subsequent wars might go to prove. Anyway, I'm going to try to skip on. I spent a lot of time on that because I thought, what is the Democratic Party? Interesting question. What is the difference between Democrats and Republicans? This is just my order for answering these questions in my way. I used to say back about 10 years ago that Democrats were capitalism with a human face and Republicans were capitalism with an iron fist. But today, in light of changing tendencies among the Democratic Party, I hardly see that human face there anymore. 14 years ago, under the Obama administration, this country was doing détente, easing tensions with Cuba and Iran for the first time in like 50 years. But nowadays, that seems like a distant memory. So there's certainly not easing tensions with Iran or Cuba for that matter. So instead, today, Democrats continue to expand the military use, as our recent presidential nominee for the Democrats has said they wanted to have the most lethal military in the world, which I, don't know if that's an objective I would ever want in my life. But anyway, they still, expanded NSA, FBI, surveillance and torture, CIA black sites, under Democrats and Republicans. Some of the things that I think are most heinous to just humanity in general, Democrats are now, I would say, hitting a new low with their support of Israel's genocide of Palestine, which is really something in a 200-year history. I don't know that there's been a more egregious event where the Democrats took the wrong side of history. Anyway, what is the history of the Democratic Party and with the left? So I would take the view that generally the Democratic Party in its institutional form, which is the one we are in today and have been in since the time of FDR and Truman, it tries to co-opt the left. It's trying to hang on to power. The people in power want power for its own end, and so they exclude those they can't co-opt, and they co-opt those they can't exclude as much as possible. This is also based on my working with the Democratic Party of Oregon for 6 years. They have no ideology. They're completely amoral. They just do whatever. They'll say that they have an ideology. Obviously, it's not very tenable in a public relations sense to be like, I have no ideology, and I'll just do whatever you say. But that is effectively, and it's not that hard to see for those who are paying attention, that is how they operate. We could go back from FDR right after there. We have Truman starting the Cold War, dropping the nuclear bombs. This is like the Democratic Party moving further to the right. I would say after FDR's death, the Democratic Party since then is moving to the right. Biden in the 1970s and other neo-lib Democrats coming into Congress privatized airlines, the post office, privatized large sections of the military. Still being privatized today, and started really being more brazen with their overthrowing of governments, no longer just covertly doing it like in Greece in the 1950s and 60s, but doing it out more in the open like in Chile in the 1970s, democratically elected presidents and such, and going on down to Colombia and so many other countries that the CIA has helped overthrow. Anyway, and then in the 90s, you have the third way Democrats, Clinton, doing massive cuts to welfare and housing subsidies, implementing free trade as, they defined it, and deregulating things like Wall Street and student loan market. But the way that they do this too, and how it relates to the left is especially since the year 2000, it's very much one of undermining the left while trying to co-opt their rhetoric. They do this by attacking leftist figures, like Ralph Nader was a big leftist icon that nowadays pretty much only has a bad reputation, thanks largely to the Democratic Party, smearing his good name. Jill Stein was the latest, whipping post for the Democrats. They, smeared environmentalists, back in the 70s, leveled terrorist accusations against them, and today onto Antifa, Black Lives Matter. What they cannot co-opt, they exclude. They can't exclude, they co-opt. Anyway, AOC, I think, is an example of where they have co-opted previous critics of the party. She's now basically towing the party line, criticizing Sanders, telling everybody, or criticizing Jill Stein, and telling everyone that they need to vote for, Kamala Harris. And I would even say Bernie Sanders is an example of someone who's been co-opted, like a leftist figure who was much more of a critic of the party, who's now basically doing the party's bidding. And I would say, again, at a new low, they're blaming foreign plots for their unpopularity, like the whole Russiagate. They lack self-reflection and the ability to self-correct. And even more so nowadays, they're cracking down on dissent, free speech. John Kerry was just on an interview talking about how the First Amendment is too broad and allows for too much disinformation, needs to be reined in. They, of course, banned TikTok, which I think is the biggest assault on free speech probably in my lifetime. And this is largely because it's a forum for dissent. It is the platform that is mostly used by young people being the most radical. It will be banned sooner or later if it's not quite yet. They've cracked down on protests. University of Michigan, they're now charging protesters with like terrorism charges. And here in OSU, I won't get into it specifically, but they've cracked down pretty hard on the protests that happen here. They've also adopted right-wing policies and of anti-immigrant rhetoric and all of that. So my last 2 minutes, I'll try to say, what should the left do to break with the Dems, and what have we done? So it's not very easy. It's been tried before. Again, this is a really old, powerful party. I would argue the last time that someone successfully challenged the power of the Democrats, there was a civil war. That was the Republican Party, which they then took power, from having 2 Democrats win to, for the next 72 years, Democrats basically didn't have power. They only had 4 of 16 presidents from 1861 to 1933. So they've tried many times, and the Farm Labor Party, there were other examples, but they get co-opted, so be careful. I'm just gonna skip to the end because I'm running out of time, and someone is calling me at a bad time. I'm just gonna say what the DSA likes to propose as remedies, what the left can do. The inside-outside strategy was mentioned. This isn't just specific to the DSA, but it's basically saying, look, the Democratic Party, so many people are involved in it. People who we might call leftists are constantly registered members. So if you're going to just be completely outside the Democratic Party, you're going to lose a lot of your potential base of support. And then, of course, the outside, you do want to be on the outside criticizing and building power outside of the Democratic Party's corrupt establishment. And then the dirty break, with my last 30 seconds. Everybody likes to form a new party. It's really easy to just leave the Democrats. They make it easy. It's not easy to change the Democrats or even challenge their power. The dirty break is the opposite of a clean break. If a clean break is quick and easy, we just form our own party. Dirty break is slow and painful. We need to draw people from the Democratic Party, people who think of themselves as leftists, who are being channeled through the Democratic Party through, I would say, dead ends for the left, and we need to channel them out, and that's where the dirty break comes in. It's slow, it's painful, but we have to build power outside of the Democratic Party. At the same time, we're still inside the party and pulling people over. It's not easy, but I've hit 12 minutes.
Okay, let's go to Lance.
Okay, so as they've said, my name's Lance. I guess kind of just to clarify what theoretical background I'm coming from, I would consider myself a left communist of the Italian tendency, or ultra-left, it's variably called. But really the main sticking point of that is that left communists of the Italian tendency reject Stalin and the disintegration of the Russian Revolution after 1921, and as well as those current state capitalist countries, places like Cuba, China, that are often misguidedly called socialist. But going into the actual prompt, the first part of the prompt, what is the Democratic Party? And I'll echo kind of what's been said before, that at the basic level, you can call it a bourgeois party or a capitalist party. And to really understand what that means in this context, I plan to go into the history, but my co-panelists have already done that, so not to belabor the point, I'll briefly just talk about how the Democratic Party has basically shifted dramatically over time. There's been a lot of party switches in American politics. It started out as a party kind of rural landowners, artisans in the Jacksonian era, switched to become a party of the slave-owning Southern class in the 1860s. There is tension between the Bourbon Democrats in the later 19th century, which were pro-business, as well as the more progressive wing led by William Jennings Bryan. And then finally, it kind of took its most dramatic turn away from the Southern Democrats in the 1930s with the realization of the New Deal. And then, of course, the 1960s, the Southern wing of the party basically dissipated due to the Civil Rights Act. So that takes us to today, where obviously there might not be that same, so-called New Deal coalition, but the Democratic Party mainly finds support from college-educated people, minorities, people living in urban areas. And the common thread that I'd like to point out is that it has never represented the working class or the proletariat class, and it has never moved beyond the horizon of what I would call electoral politics. So for a bourgeois party that the Democratic Party is, I realize I forgot to set my timer, don't know why I brought that up there, but...
Got 10.
10, good. So for its horizons lie solely in the realm of electoral politics. So that involves mobilizing a vote every 4 years for the presidential election, mobilizing people to vote in Senate and House elections as well, and then holding on to power for those 4 years, enacting piecemeal reforms, and basically attaining votes and attaining a continual membership. So with that being said, when we dive further into the prompt and ask what's the left's history with the Democratic Party, well, I kind of take issue with the framing of that question. Kind of the idea of a unified left is really, it sounds better in practice than what it actually represents in reality. I would say as a concept, it's really vague. It can lump opposing forces together if you're just saying, well, we have a liberal, we have a Stalinist, they're both to the left of a conservative, even though they don't agree with each other on, about any position, or say an anarcho-communist or Maoist. So I kind of disagree with the framing of that question, but the way that I would conceive of a left in kind of a useful definition is all of the revolutionary class-conscious elements of the proletariat class itself, of the working class, the laboring class, whatever you want to call it, as well as the Revolutionary Party, which represents working class interests. So with that definition in mind, I think it's fair to say that the Democratic Party has not, and really in its current composition, cannot ever represent the left or represent the interests of the left. And if we look at the history of when a real left party was developing in the United States, around the turn of the 19th and the 20th century, you had the Second International Party, which was a socialist party in America at that point, which frequently ran Eugene Debs for president against the Democratic Party, and at one point even having to run Eugene Debs from prison because the Democratic government, headed by Woodrow Wilson, had imprisoned him for being against, imperialist war. So with that being said, the way that I would envision the role of the Democratic Party with the left, not including it, is, as others have said, by co-opting its positions and channeling discontent solely into the avenue of electoral politics, rather than anything revolutionary or emancipatory. And I think this is not really a new idea in Marxist theory, really. There's a quote from Engels that I'm not going to read the entire part of, but essentially he's talking about what he calls the bourgeois socialists. And he says, referring to them, to this end, some propose mere welfare measures, while others come forward with grandiose systems of reform, which under the pretense of reorganizing society are in fact intended to preserve the foundations and hence the life of existing society. Communists must unremittingly struggle against these bourgeois socialists because they work for the enemies of communism and protect the society which communists aim to overthrow. So when you look at what the Democratic Party does in electoral avenues, it's a reformist party. So it's looking to enact reforms that make capitalism more stable, that continue the current setup of capitalism and the capitalist governments. And now that takes us to, at that point, what would be the difference between a Republican Party, which I would also, I think, probably very fairly say is a clearly bourgeois, clearly capitalist party, compared to the Democratic Party. And really, I would say the main issue lie in their messaging. So when we look at the Republicans, and these are trends that are holding true globally, a lot of what they do is they vilify foreign proletariat or immigrant workers in the nation, which is becoming especially big in Europe right now with the refugee crisis going on. Obviously, the AfD in Germany. And Republicans also lean hard into culture wars, so basically splitting the proletariat class along multiple cleavages based on sexual orientation, race, gender, things like that. And the Democrats on the other side also exploit this kind of culture war with identity politics. the idea that, oh, if my boss is a person of color, if my boss is LGBTQ, then it doesn't matter that they're still engaged in the system of capitalist relations, as well as things like the vilification of the rural proletariat, and just like I said before, just transforming all this discontent, shuffling it into the very narrow halls of reformism. So with that being said, a common position that I'll hear leftists take is, well, in this upcoming election especially, which is the third most important election of our lifetime that I've lived through, along with the past two, that we need a united front. We need to stop Trump. We need to just temporarily, we can push Kamala left like we did Joe. That didn't really work. We can push Kamala left and it'll all work out. And to me, this would be the equivalent of having your arm amputated and then putting a Band-Aid on it and saying, well, look, we did what we can, right? But did you really? I'm going to say resoundingly no, that's not a solution. Because a lot of the things that people use in this argument, whether it is, racism will be more prevalent under Trump, sexism and homophobia, all of those are integral parts of the capitalist system. When you look at race in America particularly, the distinction between African Americans and, at that point it wasn't American, but African people living in the Americas and white people kind of emerged in the 17th century when they were looking to differentiate between white indentured servants and black indentured servants. And this kind of mindset spread from there in the American South. Same can be said of sexism, that sexism is an inherent part of capitalism that can't really be changed with reforms. Women can be exploited for cheaper labor due to the wage gap. Their role in the home, their stereotypical role in the home allows longer working hours for men, and they also serve as a reserve army of labor, which we saw during World War II when all the housewives were encouraged to go to the factories. But, yeah, finish on that point. So overall, I would say that the left and the Democratic Party in that sense can't really be seen as having a coherent history together, even from the standpoint of simple harm reduction or as a popular front against fascism. And something Paul Maddox said that I think is very pertinent here is that you shouldn't serve capitalism in one form by fighting against the other form. So regardless whether it's Republicans in power or Democrats in power, that doesn't change the class struggle that's occurring. That doesn't change the inherent contradiction of bourgeois versus proletariat. So when we look at the question of should the left break with the Dems, well, the Dems have already broken with the left, so what should the left do? And I believe that the only solution lies in a revolutionary internationalist proletariat political party that organizes the working class beyond national lines and is basically an international organization. It can have national divisions. But this party will have to avoid these popular fronts with the bourgeois when the opportunity presents itself. This popular front has shown historically to be not a viable strategy. We can look at the failures of various Trotskyists in the UK Labour Party, which that Labour Party had a much stronger working class base than I could say the Democrats ever had, and their attempts were still huge failures generally, as well as the failure of the Popular Front in France after, in the interwar period, which just led to people who were communists or said they were communists supporting a democratic government. So whatever this international proletariat party is going to will be in whatever form it takes, it will have to reject bourgeois politics, the politics of reformism, as well as, hold revolutionary positions on topics like, revolutionary defeatism, given the march to generalized war that's currently occurring in the Middle East, especially with increased tensions between Iran and Palestine, as well as in Ukraine. So how much time do I have left?
2 minutes and a half.
2.5 minutes. Okay. I apologize for this being slightly disorganized, but there were just some quotes that I wanted to bring up that I couldn't really connect to the rest of my work. So when I look at what the left should do currently, I'm tempted to return to Lenin in Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder when he describes what tactical sacrifices the left should make. And he says it's entirely a matter of knowing how to apply these tactics in order to raise, not lower, the general level of proletariat class consciousness, revolutionary spirit, and ability to fight and win. So we really can't afford at this time, when the working class has been in retreat for, probably triple my lifespan ever since, the failures of the international revolution following the Russian Revolution. We cannot afford to confuse the proletariat. We can't afford to make temporary alliances to push people left, which pragmatically doesn't work and also leads to us as people who want to, completely abolish the system of wage labor, lending support to the bourgeois class. And the reform, whatever piecemeal reforms would come from, say, a Kamala presidency, which is looking even more hopeless by the day, considering her citing Goldman Sachs' support for her economic plan, as well as strangely citing her support for fracking in the last presidential debate. So, she'll do her, I guess. But I think Rosa Luxemburg put it succinctly when she said it's a class state, referring to the capitalist state. Therefore, its reform measures are not an application of social control, and it's the control of society working freely in its own labor process. They are forms of control applied by the class organization of capital to the production of capital. The so-called social reforms are enacted in the interests of capital themselves. So with that being said, I think what the working class needs is to abandon hope in electoral politics and move for true political organization alongside internationalist lines not solely hampered by the Democratic Party, which, as my co-panelists have pointed out, have basically rigged the system in America. So even moderate third parties or even capitalist third parties like the Greens are complete jokes and can't really attain any level of electoral success.
Now each panelist will have up to 3 minutes to respond to the others, and we'll go in the same order that we went in before, starting with Teresa.
Okay, thanks for all your remarks. Really thought-provoking. I just have 2 points I want to make in response. One is that at its best in U.S. history, the left has worked to build a multiracial democratic movement from the grassroots. And it's hard for me to see how a vanguard party, a small group of leftists, can enact a politics that's going to be democratic and build from the bottom up. So I'm interested in hearing sort of tactics and strategies there. I also want to just remark, yeah, the Democratic Party is a capitalist party, for sure. But I would say I think we ought not risk underestimating the tangible differences that a Harris presidency and a Trump presidency would make. And I mean that in a lot of ways, but in particular, policy matters and state power matters, and for people, particularly for marginalized groups and people, that'll make a difference. Even though in a kind of higher theoretical plane, we might say, oh, the parties aren't different from each other. I think in terms of daily lives for a lot of individuals, there will be a significant difference. Those are my 2 thoughts.
And now we go to No.
Yeah, something I wanted to get to, I think that touches a little bit on Marissa and Casey, is that I think you talked about co-option, but I think still kind of got into, or I wouldn't say misunderstood, but misunderstood how like this actually advances the ball for oppressed people and for working class people. And I think there's a quote from John Lewis, who is the head of the CIO, which the CPUSA worked in a lot during the 30s and 40s. And he said, in working with the communists, this was sort of a reactionary union leader, John Lewis, and he said, who gets the bird, the dog, or the hunter? And what he was referring to here was that he is fine with working with the communists. He's fine with bringing in the left, because him as the hunter is who actually gets the spoils. So I think in working with either with the Democrats or with a vacillating force like that, I think we have to consider who is actually leading this and how are we actually like moving things forward for a working class movement. And then I wanted to touch a little bit on sort of what Lance had said about sort of rejecting a united front or aligning with vacillating forces. I think this is an incorrect way to look at it. It's interesting that you quoted left-wing communism there, because I think Lenin kind of makes the opposite argument there, that we should be able to align with unstable forces, but be able to struggle against them at the same time. Do I have more time?
40 seconds.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, I think what I touched on a little bit in my speech about the Labor Party as a united front is a really important thing. This is something that's being brought up within the working class movement a lot right now, the idea of a Labor Party. And I think that's a much more viable thing than trying to work within the Democratic Party. Still, I think this needs to be led by a vanguard party that can struggle within it and still criticize some of the wrong ideas. But yeah, I think I'll end it there.
Great. Now we can go to Casey. All time.
So yeah, I just want to thank everybody. Thank you to the Platypus Society and Anthony for inviting me. I didn't do that at first. I just had a lot to try to get through in 12 minutes, and I left out like 25% of it. I'll just say I kind of ignored. I thought a lot about getting into debate of like, is the party, what is the left? Is the Democratic Party part of the left? Is the left separate from the party? Is it co-opting? I left that behind because I think it is essentially a semantic debate. People identify as what they want to identify, and you can debate till the end of time, you know, what is the appropriate label to apply to people. I just call people what they like to be called usually. I would say that there are actual differences, you know, between the Democrats and Republicans. I didn't want to gloss over that, even though I think they're like 90% the same. That 10% is important to a lot of people, and that 10% is like protection for LGBTQ rights and gender-affirming care and abortion access and lots of things that I think are important. But yet, when it comes to so many issues, support for Israel, expansion of the military budget, crackdown on dissent, mass surveillance, CIA whatever, like issues that I consider really important, the mass printing of a lot of money, we'll just call it like, yeah, the Dems and the Republicans have unanimity in that. And so we shouldn't ignore that either. I think that from my perspective, I don't think we should abandon electoral politics, but I think it's important to recognize that there are limitations with what we can do within them. I'm kind of a, take all the approaches kind of activist. As a veteran of the United States Army myself, which I didn't get into, I really don't like the idea of that we try to resolve all of our political differences outside of politics, outside of words, because what happens in that instance is that we pick up rifles and lots of my friends get killed. So I do support on some level a vanguard party, but I think violence should always be minimized and attempted to be minimized as much as possible. If not just for moral reasons and for strategic reasons. It's hard to get a lot of people on your side when you're just kind of ruthlessly killing people or throwing them in prison or excommunicating them from power or whatever. I'm a pluralist. I think, I do want the Democrats to not be in power, but I think there's going to be room for liberal progressives in my ideal socialist democracy. I don't know what the time is, but I would say that
30 seconds.
30, oh gosh, I'm always out of time. All right, so co-opting the Democrats is like playing with fire a little bit. Like if you let the fire burn, it's gonna keep burning, but if you try to put it out, you might get burned too. So be very careful. But the clear option here is to not just let it burn on its own, because you know what's gonna happen that way. If you try to put the fire out, yeah, you might burn, you might die, but at least you have a chance of putting it out versus it just goes. So that's where the dirty break comes in. It's like a little bit like playing with fire. And I just say, yeah, with Lenin had the idea, said in this, one of his speeches, because I'm also a sort of Lenin scholar myself, said that it gets translated a lot of different ways because it's Russian, but basically no party should be afraid to lend another party their hand who isn't unsure of their own footing. So if your party is stable, you should be able to work with other parties. Only those parties who are unsure of themselves, shouldn't be working with others.
Thank you, Casey. And we can go to Lance.
So I guess I'll start my response by hitting on the hot topic of tangible differences between the Democrats and Republicans in governance. And I think it's a valid thing, at a surface level. It definitely makes sense to say, oh, well, on a lesser evil scale or in a harm reduction sense. But I think that ignores how the Democratic Party really enables the Republican Party to do these things. If we look at just the last couple of years, Roe v. Wade was overturned under a Democratic president, and there have been numerous opportunities, just specifically in reproductive rights, where a Democratic president had a supermajority. You know, both houses of Congress, I think, happened once in the Obama years, once in the Biden years, if I'm not mistaken, and they just don't do it. They don't enshrine it into a national law. And when we talk about co-optation, that's really what it is. They want you to keep voting for them as an electoral party. So they dangle abortion access, they dangle LGBTQ rights over your head to kind of encourage you, oh, well, you know, we're not perfect, we're really not, you know, the best, but at least we're not those guys, you know, we'll do this if you keep us in power. So I think that's kind of where the tangible difference argument begins to fall apart. But regarding, I guess another thing that's come up in a lot of these responses is the idea of like, oh, vanguard party versus, you know, mass action or something along those lines. And I think it kind of ignores like historically what we've seen from the working class when it has seized power. And I'll use the example of, you know, the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, because in my opinion, and I think most people would agree, it was probably the high point of the working class movement of the 20th century, right? And what happened there was the Bolsheviks, they were a party, but I wouldn't say that they were a vanguard party and that they were ahead of the class, right? A lot of the movement of the Russian workers actually preempted a response from the Bolshevik party. And that's because at a Marxist level, the class is the revolutionary entity. So it's the revolutionary working class with its party. The party can't drag the class along with it, which is what happened after the counter-revolution in Russia. You know, Stalin, it became a one-party dictatorship as opposed to an actual dictatorship of the proletariat with Soviets running things. And as far as, you know, the question of, oh, isn't that very radical? You know, you won't be able to convert a mass of people outside of participation in electoral politics. Once again, I'll return to the history that the Bolsheviks never had a majority. They weren't even a majority of socialist parties. You know, there was the socialist revolutionaries, the Mensheviks, but yet the revolutionary class basically put in work, so to speak, but basically radicalized themselves through their own self-action, right? They began, you know, International Women's Day, female workers marched with soldiers abandoned their posts, and the class got itself rolling. So we don't need to convert. I think it's an idealist thing to say, to you know, claim we need to, you know, de-radicalize ourselves so we can gain mass support. The mass support, generally speaking, is going to come after the revolutionary action and not vice versa.
Okay, thank you, Max. That is our response period, and now we can take some questions from our audience. Yes, I see one at the back there.
I'm just curious because I kind of got here a little bit late, and I hear everyone talking mainly about Vanguard Party, and I'm just curious on your guys' opinion on sectarianism in general. Just a general, like, because obviously that has led to huge problems in the past, especially in the American left. So I'm wondering if you guys have any other opinions other than it's bad, or if you have more in-depth opinion on that, or just anything related to that.
Is there anyone who has a particular?
I think we should go down the line on this one.
Let's go down the line, yeah. No.
Yeah. Well, Marx talks a little bit about what he means by sectarianism in the Communist Manifesto, and that's sort of creating yourself as a sect outside of the working class movement. And so I think that's really a problem. I mean, there's many different trends within like the broader left, and I think none of us should be afraid to criticize each other because we're trying to come to the correct understanding to how to move forward a revolutionary movement. But the problem comes if you're doing that in an unprincipled way, if you're not willing to find unity where you can find it, to struggle towards a larger unity, or when you're just kind of hauling yourself off into this smaller sect. That's kind of what Marx talks about with sectarianism outside of the existing movement.
Yeah, and to kind of build off on that, I guess when a lot of people think of sectarianism, they think of like the stereotypical, oh, leftists infighting, you know, they can never accomplish anything. But I think that kind of speaks to, you know, when Marx talked about sectarianism, basically the idea was that you're intentionally closing off your doors to people, and you just want to have like, you know, a Babu society equals a small revolutionary like group of people that just immediately changes society without the mass participation of the class. So I think when we talk about sectarianism today, it's kind of in a different vein, but I think what should be one of the main goals is like theoretical critique, I wouldn't say is sectarianism. I think that's an incredibly important part of the movement, especially when we're in a period where there's been a long period of class retreat. The working class is not very organized, not very powerful. There should be, opportunities for people to differentiate their positions. I think at the level that there is a common enemy, this was a Marx quote that I pulled out when he was talking about the Eisenacher and the Lassalle, kind of basically from Critique of the Gotha program, where there's a Lassallean Socialist Party and a Marxist Socialist Party in Germany. He says if they can't agree on a common program, or if one group's going to have to subvert the revolutionary aspect to join together, one should simply have concluded an agreement for action against the common enemy. So I think at that level of sectarianism, as long as there is a common enemy of the bourgeois, and it's not someone who's, like I said, the bourgeois socialist who will channel things into reformism or other avenues, then I think sectarianism, it's right to critique it. But.
Yeah, so there's sectarianism kind of in a government versus in a movement, and then of course there's this in-between phase where your movement is trying to take power and become a government. So sectarianism in a government seems totally fine, it's just like democracy, there's differences of opinion, different factions vie for power and debate each other and all that stuff, that's fine. But what happens where sectarianism gets to be criticized a lot is when it's, in a movement, you're trying to build power and yet you have different factions within. And the thing is, as your movement gains even a little bit of power, these divisions are going to come up. So I'm okay, I'm okay with the United Front because I think the Democratic Socialist line is good enough to stand on its own. And I'm fine with working with communists and anarchists and liberals where there is common ground to have been done. But only because I'm secure in the fact that, I think the DSA will be fine when that coalition dissolves or whatever. It won't be co-opted into the Democratic Party any more than it would have been otherwise. But that's just my feeling on it, and the actual situation and how it goes in the moment would be quite different and sort of hypothetically, like when we have a real democracy in this country, more than two parties. But anyway, because we only have the two-party system, sectarian divisions within movements become so important because they are what breaks apart our ability to challenge the two-party system. I don't have a great resolution to any of this. It's that if I knew the way to overcome the sectarian divisions on the left, I probably wouldn't be sitting here.
Marisa, did you have?
Yeah, just a very short thing to say, which is that I think that kind of sectarianism on the left comes out of a notion that there's a correct understanding of the world and a correct mechanism for moving forward. And I just think that's a problematic way of thinking about social and political change, because I believe in participatory democracy. So I'll just say that.
Okay. Any more? Another question?
Question.
And
Or somebody else.
Matthew, I think.
Good.
Matthew would like you to go first.
Yield this time.
Okay. And thanks for the remarks. It's been a great panel. And I guess one thing that you brought up, Casey, was you brought up, it's been almost 200 years since the foundation of the Democratic Party. It sort of, represents, the managing of society. I think the way you put it, there's disparate elements, and you did as well, within the Democratic Party that are held together. That the Democratic Party in some ways manages society. And I was thinking about, 200 years, but then when we're with Lance and Naomi, 100 years of Lenin, we're on the 100th year since he passed, 1924. And so it seems like that is not as durable. The durability of the 20th century is in the Democratic Party. The kind of the changes that have happened, when the crisis of the Great Depression isn't in some ways, the communists and socialists are sidelined, as you pointed out, and it's FDR that ultimately reshapes the world, as you put it, Casey, and kind of a new system. And then the crisis of the New Deal in the 1960s, it's not the left, it's Bill Clinton who sort of reorganizes society. And I suppose what you brought up, Naomi, that there's a new, the analysis is that there's a new crisis in the midst. Maybe, stemming maybe as far back as the 2008 downturn. And I wondered, when you look at the last 20 years of, and even this larger tradition of sort of failing to cohere something, what do you think the lessons are of both those failures but also the successes of the Democratic Party? What does it say about politics? Maybe more stridently, like, we're in a crisis right now. Why, Casey, you've been on, you and I have had this conversation in the past. Why were the millennial generations unable to build something independently? Why did it, collapse? What was, in your reflections and looking back, why was that? Why was that, but what does it mean about politics? Like, what did you misunderstand? What, in hindsight, what do you think, I actually don't really understand?
This is a difficult question to answer. Not that it's like difficult for me to like formulate an answer, but it's just hard to say out loud because it gets kind of dark. I think, so I became politically active in 2011 with the whole Occupy Wall Street movement, sort of the response to the Great Recession, So following the Great Recession, there's like, hey, we gotta find $1 trillion of cuts in the federal budget. And then Occupy Wall Street was like, no, you don't. No, better find $1 trillion of rich people's money to pay for shit. Which ultimately is kind of a little compromise what happened. But anyway, at that time, I think I was naive and so many others were about how much political freedom and civil rights we still had in this country and how I was naive personally, like about how much the state would come in to crack down on what I saw was like a peaceful protest. So I think, this is where I agree with some of our speakers, Lance and Naomi, that like there are limitations on what we can do electorally in the United States, given, limitations on free speech, social media being censored and mainstream media being incredibly censored. Yeah, so I'll just say this, end on this point, is like what maybe we didn't understand and what is perhaps another one of these histories that has largely gone untold is that Occupy Wall Street movement had, dozens, maybe hundreds of occupations around the country, and they were cracked down on in a coordinated way. They didn't fizzle out because, the college kids got stoned and went off and whatever. They got beaten with batons, their property was taken, destroyed, lots of them were arrested en masse, pepper sprayed. I was one of them. It happened across Oregon. There was occupations in Portland, Eugene, Southern Oregon, probably others. So that's what I mean about the lack of civil rights. We were there peacefully just saying hey, maybe we gotta try to regulate Wall Street or something, maybe bail out the people instead of the banks. But they were like, we are a country ruled by the banks. Screw you, get the hell out of here, Anyway, my 2 cents on it. Underestimated the draconian methods that even a Democratic president would use to crack down on this thing. A mistake I will not make again.
Anyone else? Yeah, Naomi?
Yeah, sure. I think I can touch on this a little bit. I think a lot of, whether we look back at the 60s or some of the more successes in the 30s or Occupy, the millennial sort of left, I think a big factor in why some of those succeeded or didn't succeed is the presence of a communist party, and to have a more organized theoretical center that can be guiding these things. And I think since the 60s, coming out of there, a lot of the left has kind of abandoned that idea and kind of, like you were saying, Marissa, sort of not rejecting the idea that there are correct ideas and therefore kind of rejecting Marxism. And I think that sort of postmodernist influence is a big one in why the sort of more broader left or the people who maybe in a different era with different politics would have started organizing a communist party that could help lead these things. And the other thing that's very related to this is that the sort of broad left, which isn't so organized, isn't so clear on some of these bigger questions, is really sort of separated from the working class movement. This is a really big thing that Lenin talks about a lot, but that the communist movement and the working class movement are actually two separate things. I think, Lance, you kind of brought up that they were kind of the same thing, that the communist movement is the most advanced of the proletariat, but that's not necessarily the case. the communist movement and Marxism kind of arise as a separate thing, usually within, not spontaneously from the working class, but then need to be able to sort of bring that revolutionary theory to the working class. And so, yeah, I think those are a couple of key reasons: a lack of involvement with the working class movement, and the lack of a communist party, which are very much linked in my eyes.
Do Marisa or
Sure, if it's open, I'll just chime in. But I think Occupy specifically, if we're going to like isolate something, wasn't really a movement that was organized on class lines per se, compared to the movements of the past. When we look at, there wasn't only working class people, only literal wage laborers participating on Occupy. It was kind of a unified movement, and that kind of, when we looked at the goals of Occupy, they were really unclear. There was no really revolutionary program, or a program that, as I mentioned earlier, eclipsed kind of like reformism working within the capitalist system. So there wasn't really any of those emancipatory demands, which I think can kind of be explained by, the global decline and retreat of working class political organization in the past 70 years, which makes it so that we aren't able to kind of take advantage of these crises as the working class would be able to in the past. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I have a question for Naomi, just for additional clarification. You mentioned having correct ideas about what to do to go forward. I just wanted to say, how do you define like correct in that instance, or what do you sort of mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Marxism is a science. Like, that's how Marx conceived it. That's how Lenin, that's how Mao, that's how Marxism has been understood. And that means it's both materialist as well as dialectical. And I won't get too much more into that. But, and so that means there are, just like in any other science, like you test something in chemistry, you test something in physics, the pen is gonna fall to the ground. You can test that over and over again, and that's gonna work. So I think rooting things in dialectical materialism in Marxism is how we are able to come to correct ideas. And that's much different because Marxism is a social science. It's not quite as exact as chemistry, right? But we can analyze things such as Occupy Wall Street and different protest movements and see that those are only going to get so far, right? Those aren't creating a revolution. Those, we can't just go and occupy a space and then we're going to totally transform capitalist social relations, exploitation and the power that the capitalist class has is still going to be there. So does that kind of get at your question? I think rooting things in a materialist analysis is how we can move forward on a correct strategy. And I guess I could touch on what I think that is, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I think right now for MCU, Maoist Communist Union, the organization I'm a part of, I think there's two very important things that we've kind of come to understand for the past year or so. One, what I was talking about, the importance of understanding Marxism and the sort of revolutionary communist movement as a separate thing from the working class movement. And then also the need for that revolutionary communist movement to fuse itself with the working class. But right now, the communist movement is very small, if even a movement at all. So what MCU understands our current task to do, and for those that know some history of the Russian Revolution, we would be much more in about the 1880s or so, when the Marxists there, this is before Lenin, Plekhanov, would have been struggling against this ideology called neurotinism, which is kind of like a sort of an anarchism. I don't need to get into that, but which is what I kind of touched on in my speech a little bit about struggling against different trends and sort of being able to unify the whole sort of Marxist milieu, and also growing that around what we think is the correct idea, which is Marxism, Leninism, Maoism.
Do other people want to talk about correct strategy at all, or we do have more questions also, I think.
I'm just good for questions.
I saw one from Matthew who we had earlier.
So I think more clear ways to ask this question. So I hear a lot of strategies from. I hear we sort of ended the response period with disagreements of how does one deal with the Democratic Party, in that the question is how does one build a mass movement, and with some argument of that, well, if you're going to build a mass movement, you have to start with the Democratic Party on one side versus no, the best way to deal with the to build a mass movement is to look at the history in which there's an independent mass movement is brought up from political action, right? So I guess the question that I have is where do, if one is going to try to to pull from the Democratic Party, in what directions are people going to go? And if you argue that there's going to be an independent mass movement that forms from independent political action, how does that form? Because at least from what I see historically, the independent political movement seems to already be there before the Vanguard Party formed. So my question would then be, if you're going to build a Vanguard Party that then builds that, how would that happen? I guess that's my question.
Go first. Lance?
Yeah, I'll go first. I'll switch it up. Is that
Yeah,
okay?
go for it.
Okay, cool.
No, I took the one before.
Yeah, you good. So I guess kind of starting with the, where are these people coming from? How are you going to draw from the Democratic Party? I think that's kind of like a false premise, because when you look at it, last election, I think only it was about 33% of eligible voters didn't even vote, right? And that's not including people who are currently disenfranchised from, say, being a convicted felon, or who isn't, someone who's an undocumented immigrant who can't go and vote, things like that. So I think there's obviously rising dissatisfaction with electoral politics, and especially with the Democratic Party, which is not really being aided, despite the fact, Kamala Harris was kind of touted as, okay, we have a black female vice president, that's really good, we'll be able to make some progress, we can push Biden left. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, and really can't happen in the current system we have. So I think there's already kind of this mass dissatisfaction with society that, it's probably why most of you are in this room right now, which is obviously not enough for a party, but it's a start, right? And as far as where do we start, well, like I said, I mentioned, an internationalist political party that represents the, working class. And I think when we're in a period without kind of crisis, it's kind of hard to see beyond the weeds and say, okay, well, where do we start, right? Of course, we're kind of trending in that direction, the march towards general warfare, looming economic crises, there's a bunch of bubbles that are probably going to pop. And in those revolutionary periods, it's a lot easier to see where the support's going to come from and how we can kind of concretely mobilize. But I think in these less revolutionary periods, it's about building a party with a theoretical foundation who's going to continue the revolutionary legacy of the past and kind of maintain a solid theoretical program, which I think there are a few good organizations already in existence who are following that line. Back there, I have a broadsheet from the Internationalist Communist Tendency, who I sympathize with. I'm not a member, but I think they're doing good work in that realm. And there's plenty of international organizations with varying levels of support in America specifically, but all of which have these international memberships, like League of Internationalist Communists, that's one off my head, or the Internationalist Communist Party, the original Bordegas. So, yeah.
Try to keep this one brief because I'm talking a bit, but I'll just say that I came to DSA from a different socialist party. I kind of am self-taught. I was going to talk about some of the books that influenced me, but I already had an introduction. I think it gives me a different perspective. Like, to me, I came from the more vanguardist, radical left side of it, and it's hard to explain, I guess, just to say that, like, the Democratic Party is very good at maintaining its power. When you try to form these revolutionary parties outside of mainstream politics, you tend to only go so far. It's been tried many, many times. The key here is a mass party. How do you create a mass party? So, like, if you have this spectrum of, like, Vanguard over here who's completely abandoned electoral politics, using whatever, let's say, extra legal means they can, and then those over here who are just going for completely electoral politics, trying to use the most legal and easiest, straightforward means. I think the DSA is trying to get somewhere in between, right? Like, we're not trying to only work within the Democratic Party, but we're not trying to pretend like it doesn't exist and isn't the main vehicle for politics. I don't want to say left-wing politics, but some kind of politics here in this country. So I'll just say, yeah, I don't think we have to de-radicalize ourselves to build a mass party. I think it's important to keep our principles. Yeah, and I'll just, another way to talk about this is to use an analogy, the government, like Russia, right? So how do we do, like, what happened in Russia and have a revolution there? I think that, to me, is like a little bit of historical folly. Russia, right before the revolution, just kind of like lost World War I. And so, like, yeah, if our government loses World War III, then yeah, you best believe it'll be a vulnerable, weak government in that moment and a lot more likely to, say, fall prey to a revolution. But until that time, you know, we have arguably the strongest state power apparatus in the world, not just with the military, but like CIA, New York Police Department is the largest police department. They work closely with the FBI, NSA. So, like, you know, Operations COINTELPRO, Pirouette, Operations Chaos, look up these things. It's been tried. I just think that there are other ways, other avenues, and I guess I'm proposing as an alternative my sort of in the middle, somewhere between electoral politics and Vanguard Party DSA strategy, which I did not invent and I had nothing to do with its invention. I just thought it was really attractive.
I know we had a response.
Yeah, sure. I guess I want to respond a little bit to what Casey was saying and then maybe touch on the question if that's okay. Yeah, I think your example of the Russian Revolution is an interesting one, and I think it's important to keep in mind that, you know, we're not always in a revolutionary situation, such as after World War I. So, like, we can't just have a revolution like right now. I think that's something a lot of the protest politics sort of misunderstand what the revolution actually is. Like, is this like a revolution just by getting a lot of people like together in one area? But we're also not going to be able to have a revolution without a vanguard party. And so, if we're going to focus on just building a mass party, or still sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the Democrats, that's I think clearly not going to lead to revolution. As far as the question in terms of how do we like engage with like existing movements today, I think it's important to sort of differentiate between like what some of these movements are and understand sort of the class basis of them. So like the working class movement today is something that communists, I think, need to understand a lot better and engage with a lot more. MCU is doing a lot of work within within UPS and within the Teamsters, and was part of the contract struggle to vote no in 2023 last summer. And I think that was a really good way to engage with a lot of workers who, some of them haven't broken from the Democratic Party, still have like these ideas, but that doesn't mean working within the political like party of the Democrats. And so that sort of economic struggle is like one sphere versus like the politics of a party, or even say like the movement against the genocide in Palestine is like something that we can like intervene in and sort of try to clarify things for people, but that doesn't mean that we should work with the Democrats in any way, because as I kind of said in my speech, I think that will just confuse what is actually needs to be done, which is a revolution to actually solve these problems.
Okay. Let's have some. I see his hand over here.
Can I ask, you referenced the red papers. Is that your publication? And is then your organization an offshoot or the same thing as the Revolutionary Union that published red papers back in the 70s?
Red Pages, it is a different, similar name. It is not an offshoot. That's a good question of the RU or the RCP. We have some pretty big differences with them.
But you're all communists.
Yeah, well, yes.
Okay, all right. Thanks. But
Okay.
So my real question
Yeah.
is, you got a lot of students on campus and not very many showed up here today. And I think this is just a very interesting and informative panel. And it harkens me back to the 60s and 70s, which I experienced, and it could be the same kind of panel. And especially with respect to like communist agenda, it's still the same and still very small. And if it ever grew, it would face the same thing that the Occupy Wall Street folks did, or any other kind of movement where the powers that be would squash it, right? But it's never advanced very much. I mean, I think the working class really had an opportunity in the early part of the 20th century, right? And they didn't latch on to it. That's where Eugene Debs and, So I just think, who's going to take control of the students now? And student movement in the 60s was really focused on the Vietnam War. I mean, SDS and then the Weather Underground. And they had a great documentary last time that these guys showed about the Weather Underground. And anyway, because I asked the question, is the Palestinian, the people that are protesting on the college campuses last year anyway, which I don't, it's really in the college, season right now. I don't know if we're going to see anything on campus, but it seems to me the Democratic Party is trying to bring more people in than any other kind of movement is right now. So I think they're going to have success, get out the vote, anti-Trump, whatever, right? So is there going to be any success with any other kind of movement other than the Democrats on campuses?
So a question about the role of students, and whether how
It's kind of huge.
Yeah.
I could give it a shot, but not that I have a great answer. I'll just say that, having worked inside the Democratic Party of Oregon, I was a member of the State Central Committee, which is how the Democratic Party of Oregon is like its highest body. It was elected from the County Central Committee of Washington County. Anyway, when you get inside the party, you see its operations, its machinery. It doesn't seem so complicated and such like this monolithic, Leviathan or whatever. But it's important to mention that, they raise and spend millions, billions of dollars every year to convince people to join their party, to vote for their candidates. And that is not nothing. If you go to the party stuff, they provide food, they'll give you stuff, material support they will give you if you join their party. It's important if you're trying to build an alternative to the Democratic Party. I would be there all the time and I would be like, how do all these people just keep showing up here expecting this to be an avenue for progress? And the thing is, it's also because they have lots of control over the media. You watch MSNBC News and they will tell you, go join the Democratic Party, that's where all the progress is happening, the great radical left. So they would come there and then they'd be like, well, there's no progress happening here, I can't even get a word in. But just because it's hollow on the inside doesn't mean the outside isn't very bustling and vibrant and with billions of dollars. I mean, they just got $500,000 in FTX money last year. The Oregon Democrats did illegally. It's a scandal. You can look it up. Anyway, leave it at that.
Yeah, just want to go down the line.
Yeah,
Okay,
go.
cool. So I think your question kind of reminded me of it's kind of a question of realism and like pragmatism in a sense, right? That like, how are we going to draw these? We've been trying to do this for time immemorial, right? What's happening, right? And I think that question of kind of realism is not a new one from a Marxist or communist sense. Marx wrote the dominant, the ideas of the ruling class are dominant in whatever epoch they're in. So the majority of people are going to see what's going on, and they're going to be supportive of electoral politics in some degree, right? And I think it's especially tough. We have a lot of students who are a lot of young. They think they can make change, immediate change, joining the Democratic Party or joining on the other end the Republican Party, just trying to immediately see something. But I think it's important to note that students aren't the revolutionary class, really, right? Like, it's the working class who's the revolutionary class. So a lot of the intervention for having to build a new, working class body or a party with political power isn't going to be happening necessarily on the campuses, and especially not on the campuses alone. Even if there is some, crossover with student workers, it's going to happen getting involved in, strikes that are going on. Drawing workers away from the unions, which are currently integrated into the Democratic Party mostly, but the capitalist process in general. And it's going to come in periods of crisis when there is widespread dissatisfaction, when there is an economic crisis going on, but there has to be some infrastructure in place beforehand. So that's kind of what we're in the period of doing, I would say, is building up a theoretical and class basis to actually intervene when the crisis hits, and not, like you said, not just pushing for like a revolution immediately with the 25 students we have in the room.
Yeah, that could go. I think, it's an interesting, important question of like how do we go from like a smaller group of communists to like a mass movement, right? And I think you mentioned like that I'm paraphrasing here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but like that in the like 20s and 30s it kind of like failed, and like the working class like didn't take up like communist politics. But I don't think that's true, and I think that there was a lot of successes from the CPUSA where working class people took up communist politics and were able to struggle against the capitalists. It clearly didn't go far enough, and CPUSA ended up making some mistakes in their strategy and sort of ended up aligning too closely with the Democratic Party, and that was a lot of their problems. And then you mentioned the Revolutionary Union, the RCP. A lot of their problems as well were that they pulled out of the unions, and that they no longer thought that they should be organizing within the working class movement. And so I think MSU is a pretty small organization right now, but I think we have a lot of clarity on this topic that we will need to build up as an organization, and only then can we really sort of fuse and start leading the working class movement, which is what's going to actually be able to lead to a revolution in this country.
I just have a brief comment, which is that the working class in the United States is a new working class. It's not the industrial white male working class of the middle 20th century. It's largely women of color, men of color, immigrants, and so that again, if that's the constituency that is viewed as needing to be out front and leading a movement, that's where again I have to question the idea of a vanguard party or a small group of people coming in and telling working class people of color, here's the correct analysis and the correct politics, particularly relying on a Marxist politics that is problematic in terms of its understanding of race.
Yes.
I had a quick thing I wanted to put into the panel. So this idea of theory and the movements. So I think, in some ways, you and Naomi have a similar idea that theory needs to come out of sort of like the active, and you can correct me on this, but the active kind of like movement of people, and sort of like, theory has some way of, it's not simply a theory outside of things, it's a theory that sort of is the interaction with actual movements. But I think about Donald Trump. So I remember the primaries leading up to the 2016 election, Jeb Bush had all of this money, had a Latino wife, there was all this anxiety in the Republican Party of, we're not gonna keep pace with demographics. And Donald Trump went in and shattered the Republican Party, went in and just did a hatchet job, and all of these people fell to the side. It's, in some sense, he seemed to have timing. He seemed to know that there was a shift going on. He had some sense that the old Republican Party of Reagan was done, and he was going to go and he was going to kick it over. And so it raises this question of theory of, being able to understand the historical moment, the crisis, and be able to respond. I suppose that is a kind of like maybe the movement, and Donald Trump famously would go into throw stuff out at the rallies until it stuck, and he's like, okay, this is the message to go with or whatever. So I wondered about that, and this idea of the party, that the party in some ways, Lance, you brought up the Russian Revolution as being not one of a majority, but one that clearly, hit the chord of the moment. Like there was a way in which they knew they had timing. And I guess what I'm a little flummoxed, like this kind of building of the party and knowing it seems like it's so far behind contemporary politics. Like contemporary politics seem to sideswipe the left completely. I was thinking about the DSA and sort of the Iraq anti-war movement, Occupy Wall Street, and suddenly this guy comes in and sort of like steals the show of like the crisis of neoliberalism had been brewing forever. All these books on neoliberalism, and suddenly Donald Trump comes in with this anti-neoliberalist position, and like, where were we? So I just kind of wonder, the extent to which we, what's missing is like an understanding of reality. Like in all of this kind of looking back 100 years, to what extent does it actually understand the present? And maybe this is what you and Lance are saying, it has to be in contact with the working class. But that seems like this insurmountable problem, and as you point out, do we even understand what it is anymore? But it seems like the two of you have a lot of agreements in some ways, in the idea of like the movements, the way that you responded to theory originally, that the kind of the pushing back on this idea of a vanguard party was, I want, it needs to come out of the movement. Like I distrust theory that comes out of a isolated, but it doesn't seem like you would disagree with that either.
I think.
And then there's the question of whether that theory is even adequate, like to the moment.
Man, this is a loaded question.
I know, but
Yeah.
sorry.
What was the question again?
Yeah.
I guess I wanted to maybe sidestepping that question a little bit. I wanted to touch on the idea of what like the working class actually looks like now, because I think you're right that it's certainly changed since the 30s. I think the aspect of deindustrialization is pretty overstated, and I touched on that a little bit in my remarks about how reindustrialization is happening. But it doesn't really have as, the focus on the working class or the industrial working class doesn't have to do with, race or gender. I think that's a sort of a false way of understanding it. And I think a good example of why it's really important for a revolution can be seen in some of the if anyone's been following the longshoreman strike that has just happened today, is that this can really shut down the functioning of the capitalist state, and that's a really important thing. And the another aspect of why focusing on the industrial working class in particular is historically this has been the people who are most open to and most understanding of Marxist theory because of their position within this large, within this contradiction of socialized labor. You're working with hundreds of people, and that's also getting taken very directly and appropriated by the capitalists. And so I think that.
I would say Marxist theory resonates most with those workers because those are the workers that are the stars in Marxist theory.
Okay.
Say that again?
Chicken.
White male industrial laborers.
I didn't say white or male, but
Industrial laborers.
yeah.
This is Marx's view of the trajectory of capitalism and of history, right? Is that it's proletarianization and it's the industrial workers that are going to be the change agents. So that's why Marx's theory might resonate most with industrial workers, because they're the ones it was written to highlight, right? It might not resonate as much with service workers who do reproductive labor, other things that Marx was not thinking about.
And so, Marisa, you think that those kinds of contingents of the labor force are made up of different demographic groups, and so maybe there's another kind of theory, perhaps?
I think that the working class is broad and engaged in lots of different kinds of work and is demographically diverse. And I think that's not how Marx was thinking about it, because Marx was writing in the 19th century.
Can I kind of push back on that if I really want to?
I was gonna kind of talk about it, but so I'll try to be short.
Yeah, go for it.
So I'll just say just something that Anthony was getting at is that like the modern Democratic Party post FDR has always been connected with the working class. It's kind of a like Democrats don't even like to talk about the Democratic Party before FDR. You know, that's when they were with the racists and stuff. But so since 2000, it's since 2008, whenever you want to mark, it's been floating. It doesn't have that connection with the working class, the Democratic Party and the working class. There's like a rhetorical, but it's being frayed more and more every day. We saw, head of the Teamsters speak on the Republican convention, good sign of that. But in lieu of this, the Democrats have said, yeah, we working class, schmirking class, we are going to give you identity politics. We're gonna make sure that the people of color, women, have like the best rights here in this country, and that will be close enough. It'll substitute somehow. Maybe we can do both. I don't know. Don't think about it too hard. I think that this dialogue happening right now is sort of emblematic of that. Like Democrats, in every time you bring up the abandonment of the working class, but we support people of color, so we haven't abandoned them. What do it's sort of a little bit of both. I would say that, yeah, there is probably more equality among people of color and white folks, working class folks today, but overall the inequality is still growing between the classes, regardless of race and gender and color and all that. That's my, keep it short.
Yeah, I guess. Sure. Just to kind of respond, not to dunk on you, but I feel like the head of the Teamsters is not a very good representation of the democratic relationship with the working class, because their union leadership, they're integrated into the capitalist system. But regardless, kind of on the idea, that was mentioned that the industrial workers are the ones that Marx wrote the theory for. I don't really believe that to be true necessarily, because Marx made the distinction that it was all wage laborers, right? His idea of the exploitation in capitalism begins with wage labor, which I would say, 100% of people in this room are probably engaged in wage labor, regardless of if they're working directly at a factory, if they're working in a service job, if they're working, regardless. But I think, when we look at the industrial proletariat, I wouldn't really assign them a special position other than to say that they're the most closely integrated with actual production of commodities, building commodities in a factory. So that might be why Marxist theory resonates with them most severely, or most, to the largest extent. But I think Marxism doesn't, in a way, it can take into account this diversity in race, this diversity in gender, this diversity in sexual orientation, because it was not based on the idea, it's not idealist, right? As we've talked about, it's supposed to, I would say that it's a scientific socialism, right? Juxtaposed against utopian socialism. So it's not built on any foundation that races are unequal, or that the sexes are unequal, or that any particular sexual orientation is better or worse than the other. It's built on the fact that the bourgeois are exploiting the proletariat, the capitalists are exploiting the working class. So kind of dividing it based on cleavages that are, in a lot of cases, as I mentioned, imposed by the capitalist class. such as gender, such as race, which are actively reinforced by things like media, by things like the economy, the wage gap. You know, getting away from the liberal idea of kind of intersectionality and move into an idea of totality, that the black proletariat are additionally, that they are more exploited than, you know, they are in a worse economic position than the white proletariat, but that is because of capitalism, you know, full stop, right? And that goes for any other cleavage that might affect the working class. And I think that's an idea that's going to take a lot of, you know, changing presentation. Because if we're putting it bluntly, the idea of like a Marxist meeting is probably a bunch of white dudes in college with like beards, right? So it's going to take work, but I don't think the theory itself is invalidated by that difficulty in
I think
presentation.
there's a lot of really good work theorizing. So I just want to push back against this idea that talking about race or gender or sexuality is identity politics, in the sense that it's some kind of, in the way that identity politics is often used by leftists to dismiss that as a problem of the middle class, and it's only about superficial symbolic diversity, etc. Race and gender are, the capitalism is structured through those, right? And so the kind of old Marxist line that we get rid of capitalism and then everybody will be equal and free, I think has been pretty effectively challenged by analyses of racial capitalism, etc. Anyway, I just wanted to make sure that it was clear that I wasn't talking about race and gender in any kind of superficial way or non-materialist way.
Okay, and we are technically 7 minutes over due for concluding remarks. If anyone has anything that they think would summarize.
Isn't that your job? You gotta summarize it all.
Yes, well.
How much time do we have for concluding remarks?
You have, I don't think it's in here actually. Concluding remarks. Just anything you feel is kind of a capstone on the whole conversation. And we can go in order of introduction again, or you don't have to.
Okay, I think it's been a great conversation, and I think these conversations are important and necessary, and we should have more of them.
Yeah, thank you to my fellow panelists and the audience. I agree. It's been a very interesting conversation. I just wanted to plug a couple of things now. As I've been mentioning, MCU is really placing an importance on sort of connecting with people who are interested in Marxism and unifying with them. And so actually starting in a week, there's going to be a open study on MLM and the Marxist theory of the state. If you're interested in that, you could go back to our table and we can get you signed up with that. And then locally as well, we're planning Corvallis Revolutionary Study Circle, or our study group here is planning on running a study at some point in the next month or so on the history of the Chinese Revolution. So if you're interested in that, come talk to us as well. Yeah, thank you.
I don't have a lot to say other than, thank you to everyone for coming out and listening to this panel. Thank you to my fellow panelists. It was very enlightening and enlivening. I think earlier I said something like, if I knew a way to resolve sectarian problems on the left, I wouldn't be here. But this is kind of how we resolve sectarian problems on the left. We have these conversations. It doesn't happen magically overnight, but over time, maybe we get to know each other and we, if not work together, don't work against each other as much. Or maybe we do. But I'll say that I sort of said a lot of my closing thoughts in the last comment. So I'll just end with the point that I didn't make in my opening comments, which is that the Democratic Party is worse than you think it is. As bad as you think it is so amoral. The corruption is all the way to the bone. It is not malice or incompetence. It is paid for indifference. Every social problem that you can think of, the Democrats are aware that it's happening, and and they are allowing it to happen, like especially in Oregon where we have like a one-party control. And there's lots that could be done. I worked in the legislature last year, and I tried to do so much, and pretty much all of it thwarted by the Democrats. One quick example is that they passed through the legislature, both houses, a bill to study having a state bank. Representative Gamba pushed it through. I think it was a great bill. It's exactly what it sounds like, state bank owned by the public bank. The governor, the democratically elected governor, vetoed that, a line item veto. So it goes to show you, like, yeah, there are some contradictions within the party itself. There's left and the right. And though I talked about how vanguard parties and people trying to do electoral politics face institutional corrupt barriers, doesn't mean I'm saying that you shouldn't try those. Wherever power can be gotten, there will be people trying to stop you from getting it. So vanguard party, electoral politics, both good ideas, and both will be met with resistance from the powers that be.
So, stereotypical. I'd like to thank all my co-panelists. Thanks to everyone who showed up tonight. As far as resources go, like I said, I have some broadsheets in the back, which are from the Internationalist Communist Tendency. I also have a blog with an accompanying Instagram. I think it's listed somewhere in the poster, PNW Internationalist. I'm going to be putting out, an article that's similar about what was discussed tonight, obviously from a Marxist perspective. And I would just urge everyone in the audience to, educate yourself, read a lot, that's important. And reach out to these organizations that are genuinely doing work for the proletariat cause. Sorry to hate on the Maoists, but organizations like the ICT or the LIC that are presenting Marxism free, the falsifications of people like Mao and Stalin. So.
Okay.